Even years later, I can still remember that day. It was the first and last time I ever went out to the movies alone. The last time I went out to the movie ever. I don't feel like I'm missing all that much, really. The movies had never been a big part of my life. I vaguely recall going out to the theaters a couple times with my mom and dad when I was little, but other than that, I had never really cared much about seeing movies in the theater. That day, however, was different. I had seen the trailers for Massacre at Willow Peak, and despite the somewhat cheesy title, it looked good. The trailers promised that it was more than just some cheesy slasher movie, and several critics attested that the movie was the most legitimately frightening horror movie to come out of Hollywood in years. I've never been a huge movie buff, but it looked good to me. And I didn't want to wait for it to come out on DVD, so I decided I might as well go to the theater. I could use a little outing anyway. Of course, first I'd have to find a way to get to the movie theater in the first place. Looking back, it's actually rather funny how adamantly my mother didn't want me going out to the movies that day. It's been years since then, and she still says that she had a bad feeling that day. That's all rubbish, of course. In reality, it was just Mom being her usual overprotective self. It just so happened that this time, her paranoia was justified. You'd have a hard time telling her that, though. Even today, she still uses that day as a cautionary tale for why children should listen to their mothers. When I first told my mother I wanted to go out, she simply told me that my dad was tired and wouldn't be able to take me. I asked my dad, though, and he said it'd be fine. He needed to pick up some groceries anyways. My mother next said that it was too late. She only ever went to the movies during the matinee hours. I said that I would pay for the movie myself, though, and so she was forced to relent on that front. That was where things started getting nasty, as they always did when my mother didn't get her way. "Who goes to the movies alone?" I remember she said. "You're supposed to go to the movies with friends or with family. You look like a freak when you go to the movies alone." I had no idea why she was being so adamant about it, but her attempts to stop me were only strengthening my resolve to go. I was a 16-year-old, for crying out loud, and it was a Friday night. Luckily, Dad was on my side, and after a few more minutes of vain arguments, we were grabbing our coats and getting ready to go. Mom gave me a bottle of pepper spray as I left, which I reluctantly shoved into my pocket. I pulled my coat around me a little, and I stepped out of the car and into the cool autumn air. It had rained recently. Technically speaking, it still was, but it was only a drizzle. The air was still humid and moist. Cold and humid was a combination I could do without. I hated the odd, clammy feeling that it gave me, and so I said a passing goodbye to my dad as he drove away and quickly made my way into the building. I didn't go so quickly through that I forgot to stop for a moment and take in the silhouette of the Golden Rail Theater. The Golden Rail had a long history in the town, and had been there nearly since its inception. It was said that the theater had fallen on hard times recently, Netflix and the newer movie theater across town having taken away a significant portion of its clientele. That being said, it wasn't in any serious state of disrepair. If it had been, I probably wouldn't have been going to it. It just had a few little problems. There were little cracks in the woodwork, and the bricks were rough in places where the paint had fallen off. The giant sign that was supposed to read Golden Reel in golden letters had lost some of its sheen and was fading day by day to a dull yellow. Normally, I wouldn't mind such small imperfections, but the dim orange light of sunset seemed to exaggerate the building's flaws, stifling its old-time charm and giving it an ominous feeling. I couldn't help but think that this was the perfect place to see a horror movie, since the place looked like it might very well be haunted. That feeling didn't decrease in the slightest as I entered the building. Having seen a sign at the ticket booth reading, "Please purchase tickets at concession stand." I guessed that it was because of the clammy weather, and didn't think twice about it as I went inside. It did feel strange, though, just walking past the deserted podium where they normally take your ticket. When I got inside, there was a single worker standing behind the concession stand. Our eyes met as I walked up to the counter. The manager must have gone home early. There was something haunting about the sight of an empty movie theater. A movie theater is supposed to be a bustling place full of people excited about the movie they are going to see or had just gone to see. Seeing it empty the way it was, devoid of a single soul other than the man at the concession stand and myself, was more than a little sad. "It looks so hollow," I said, more to myself than to the clerk at the counter.
"Empty house tonight,"
replied the man, tapping out one last message on his cell phone before pocketing it. Those words, "empty house," I still remember them even now. The way he said them so nonchalantly, completely apathetic to the sadness they contained. "There's nobody here at all?" I asked. He sighed, seemingly annoyed at the thought of actually having to deal with a customer.
"There's like 2 people here,"
he said after a moment, rolled his eyes at me, and added,
"So I guess you want tickets, right?"
When I first walked into the theater, I thought I was the only one there. I was a bit early, as I tended to be, and the screen vision was still on. I sat there, closing my eyes and reclining in the old yet comfortable seat. It was only after a few minutes that I detected something strange. I could hear an odd sound, a strange current underneath the inane chatter of screen vision. At first I thought the sound was mechanical, a broken vent or something giving off the rhythmic breathing sound. It was low, and I could just barely hear it, but it still worried me a bit. I looked around, seeing if I could find the source, and as I looked behind me, I saw that I was not alone in the theater as I had originally thought. In the very back row, there was a man. I assumed he was homeless when I first saw him because of the way he was dressed. He was garbed in layers of tattered rags that looked like they had been worn to the point of throwing away. On his outermost layer, he had a thick black coat that looked like it had been made of nice leather at one point. His long and tangled black hair was for the most part covered by a large brown hat that he, somewhat rudely, was still wearing inside. His face was almost wholly obscured by the combination of a ratty old scarf and what looked like a medical mask. It struck me as odd, a homeless man being in the theater. I wondered what he was doing, spending what little money he had on a movie rather than on food and shelter. But it quickly dawned on me that he most likely sneaked in. It wasn't as if it would have been that difficult with one lone employee manning the concession stand. I don't know why, but his presence disturbed me somehow. Maybe it was the fact that he seemed so out of place, or maybe it was the fact that I was alone in the theater with him. But I just didn't feel right being near him. That, along with the strange sound that I had still yet to place, was starting to make me a bit nervous. I wondered if maybe I just should have taken my mom's advice and stayed in. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to regain my calm while waiting for the movie to start. It was a vain effort, though, as every breath I took only made me feel more anxious. After a bit, it dawned on me that I had forgotten to buy snacks. Really, it was just an excuse to get up and walk around, but nonetheless, I decided to go and get myself some popcorn from the concession stand. As I got up, I saw the man turn to look at me. Our eyes met, and I thought I heard him say something in the distance. It wasn't a very large theater, but He was way in the back row, and I was near the front. Once more he attempted to say something, and this time I was sure I heard him. I didn't really want to, but he was obviously trying to say something to me, and so, against my better judgment, I walked up the aisle towards the man. As I got closer to him, I started to notice several things. He was indeed wearing a medical mask, one that was blotched with some yellow stain. I preferred not to speculate about what it was. His entire body was covered in sweat. Most of his skin was hidden by clothing, but I could see the perspiration beading up on his face, and there were dark stains forming on his chest, even through the multiple sweaters he wore. What skin he did show was pale and ruddy. His eyes were jaundiced, and despite having rather broad shoulders, he had a general look of sickliness about him. I assumed this was the reason for the medical mask. I've always been a bit of a germaphobe, and so even being around this guy was starting to turn my stomach. The most sickening thing about him, though, was his breathing. I'd originally thought that the sound was something medical, and listening to the eerie noise emitting from the man's throat, I realized that no one could fault me for not recognizing that sound as being human in origin. It was a low, slow wheeze that poured rhythmically from his throat. But there was also a wet gurgling sound underneath it. It was the type of wheeze you get when you have a lot of mucus in your throat, and I was briefly reminded of my Aunt Valerie, who had a whooping cough. He wasn't coughing, though, just sort of gurgling. The yellow stain on his mask suddenly made more sense.
Where are you going?
I suddenly snapped to attention, realizing that I had been staring at the man. To the concession stand, I replied automatically. It never occurred to me that it was none of his business.
Can you go? For me too?
The man asked. It took me a few seconds to realize that he wanted me to go to the concession stand for him. There was something off about the way he spoke. His voice was rather high-pitched and soft. He never seemed to speak above a whisper. That wasn't the most particular thing about it, though. No, the most off-putting thing about his voice was the pain it seemed to cause him. As if it hurt him just to speak. It almost reminded me of the time when I was young and had strep throat. I remember back then it hurt even just to swallow something as simple as water, let alone speak. The pained expression in his yellowed eyes, combined with his rather severe stutter, made me feel bad for the man. It didn't ease my apprehension, though.
I have money.
He said, apparently seeing the look of uncertainty on my face. He began digging around in his trouser pockets, but seemed to be having some trouble. I noticed that he seemed to be wearing more than one pair of pants, and that the outer layers seemed to be straining at the seams. After a bit of struggling, he finally stood up in order to allow himself easier access to his pockets. I hadn't realized before now just how large this man was. I noticed his rather broad shoulders, but I hadn't anticipated just how tall he'd be. As he stood there digging in his pockets, I estimated that he must have been at least 6'7", but I honestly wouldn't have been surprised if he was over 7 foot. He found his money, and then, much to my dismay, began walking towards me. He seemed to get taller with every lumbering step he took in my direction. I looked up at him, and he held out a large hand with a few dollars in them. Without thinking, I reached out and took the bills from him. His hand was thick and calloused all over. He seemed to have sores on his palm, and the tips of his fingers were crusted with what looked to be some sort of rash. I took the money from his hand, never even thinking about the fact that I had never actually agreed to go to the concession stand for him. At that point, with his massive form towering over me, I probably would have agreed to anything. What do you want? I asked. He looked down at me. For a moment there was silence. I looked into his jaundiced eyes as the abnormal sound of his breathing spread throughout the theater.
2 large lemonades and a chocolate baba,
He said eventually. I nodded in reply. Now that he was standing so close to me, I was beginning to pick up a rancid scent coming from the man. It was slight, but it was there. It smelled almost like spoiled milk. Like everything else about the man, though, it was layered. Underneath the spoiled smell, there was something else. It was familiar, but I couldn't quite place what it was. I honestly just wanted to get away from the man as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
You're welcome, I replied, smiling as best as I could manage. With that, I turned and did my best to maintain a normal walking pace as I walked down the stairs and out of the theater. A huge wave of relief came over me as I walked out into the lobby. I looked down at the money that the man had given me. It was darkened and soggy with what I could only hope was sweat. Not only that, but it looked like he had given me about $4. Not nearly enough for the snacks he wanted. As I walked up to the concession stand, I considered what to do. Honestly, if I had a car, I probably would have dumped the money in the garbage, driven home, and washed my hands about 1,000 times over. I didn't have a car, though. If I wanted to go home, I would have to call my father and ask him to come get me. Normally, that would be no big deal, but my dad wasn't home at the moment. He was at the grocery store, and that was in the opposite direction from the theater. If I was lucky, assuming he just dropped everything and came immediately, he might get there in about 45 minutes if the lights were with him, in an hour if they weren't. It wasn't so much the wait that bothered me so much as it was the fact that an hour would be more than enough time for the large man in the theater to get irritated and come looking for his snacks. He might even think that I'd run off with the money he'd given me. I did not want to make that man angry. As I walked up to the concession stand, the man at the counter gave me yet another disdainful look, clearly upset of having to actually do his job. His expression changed, though, when I put the damp money down on the counter along with some of my own.
So I guess you met him?
Said the concession worker, a knowing look in his eyes. He seemed to get a bit nervous at mentioning the man.
Man, that guy came in earlier and paid for his ticket with a bunch of soggy money. I would have turned it down if the guy wasn't the size of a house.
I nodded as I ordered the man's concessions. I wasn't feeling very hungry, and so I just ordered up water for myself.
I mean, did you see the guy? He's wearing all these clothes that look like it came out of a trash can or something. And he's got all these sores. It's like he was deformed, like he was a leper or something. And do you smell him? Guy smells like fish. Rotting old fish. Seriously. All the years I've been working here, I've never seen a freak like that.
The concession worker continued on as he went about preparing my order. It was hard to make out his tone. He seemed both amused and nervous at the same time. This was clearly the most novel thing that had happened to him the entire evening. But at the same time, it seemed like the man scared him a little, in the same way that he scared me. I personally couldn't help but think about his choice of words. Deformed. Like a leper. I started to think about the man's circumstances. Maybe he couldn't help the way he looked. Maybe he had a genetic disorder or something? If that was the truth, then what right did we have treating him the way we were? He had just as much a right to enjoy the movies as anyone else did. I took the concessions when the worker gave them to me and began to make my way back to the theater. I still couldn't help but feel nervous as I walked back into the now darkened theater. There was just something about the man, a sort of aura of uneasiness that he gave off. I walked up the stairs and realized that the man was sitting a few rows closer than he had been before. I just tried to shrug this off as nothing, but my mind wouldn't let me. I noticed the smell again as I got closer to him. He had stripped off his large leather jacket, which seemed to unleash the smell. Just as the concession worker said, I could indeed smell the unique aroma of fish. It wasn't quite as bad as he made it out to be, but it was definitely there. I also noticed the way his shirts were pulled tight around his thick arms. Now that the jacket was gone, I could clearly make out his massive shoulders and barrel chest moving rhythmically with his obscene, gurgling breaths. He had removed his scarves as well, and I could see that the same red rash that was on his fingers was also covering his neck, giving it an almost scaly appearance. Summoning up my courage, I walked over to the man and handed him his food. He thanked me in his pained whisper of a voice. I then went back to my seat, making sure that it was decently far away from the man. I tried not to think about the man. Tried to concentrate on the movie. Trailers that were flashing across the scene. It was useless, though. Putting him out of sight only seemed to set him more firmly in my mind. All I could think about was him sitting there, behind me. I couldn't see him, couldn't see what he was doing. For all I knew, while I was watching the screen, he could be watching me. My hands were starting to sweat, and I realized that they still felt sticky and odd from handling the money the man had given me earlier. I remembered the crusted rash that had been on his fingers and decided that I desperately needed to wash my hands. Using this as an excuse to myself, I got up and walked out of the theater, this time not even trying to hide the speed with which I did so. As I turned to leave, I looked back. And perhaps it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn that the man was sitting a row or two closer than he had been before when I sat down. I washed my hands as thoroughly as possible when I got to the bathroom. I made the water as hot as I could without scalding myself and used a liberal amount of soap. By the time I was done, my fingers were starting to prune up. I splashed some water on my face and grabbed a paper towel from the dispenser. For a few minutes, I just stared at my cell phone, wondering what to do. Dad would probably still be at the grocery store at this point. I felt nervous, but also childish. I had made such a big deal about coming here, and now I was going to call my dad to come and pick me up just because I couldn't deal with a stranger? I sighed to myself and thought about what to do. When I walked back into the theater, I realized that the man had moved again. He was sitting in my row. I had no idea why, but I knew it was my row because he was sitting just a couple of seats away from where I had let my drink. I thought briefly about what to do. I couldn't sit in a different row. If I did, it would be obvious that I was just doing it to avoid him, especially since my drink was still in that row, indicating where I had been. This guy was about 3 times my size, and I really didn't want to make him angry. Reluctantly, I went back to my seat and sat down. The man said nothing, although I could see through the corner of my eye that he had turned in my direction. I kept my eyes firmly pointed at the screen. The movie began quietly, and so it was easy for me to hear the crinkling of the man unwrapping his chocolate bar. I'm really not sure why, but somehow curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself slowly turning my head to look at the man. He had taken his medical mask down in order to eat, and I saw, much to my disgust, that the same rash that covered his fingers and neck had also spread to his mouth. His lips were dark, like a lifetime smoker's, and his nose seemed to hang awkwardly on his face as if it had been broken at one point and healed improperly. None of these things are what made me leave the theater, though. What made me leave the theater was the fact that as he leaned in to take a bite of his chocolate bar, I saw inside his mouth a row of sharpened teeth. Without hesitation, I instantly got up from my seat and headed for the door, not even bothering to grab my drink. As I left, I saw the man putting his mask and jacket back on. I felt a pang of guilt go through me as I thought that I might have made him feel bad about his appearance. But my fear overcame my guilt, and I walked out of the theater, out of the building, into the far end of the parking lot without further delay. There I called my father and asked him to come pick me up. When my dad asked me why I wanted to leave, I told him that it was because I felt really sick. Something that wasn't entirely a lie. I didn't really notice it until I got out into the open air, but being stuck in that theater with the man had been making me steadily more and more nauseous. I don't know whether it was the sight or the smell of the man that had done it, but I knew that had anything been in my stomach, it most likely would have been splattered all over the pavement at that point. My father made good time and got there in about 30 minutes. I never asked him, but I've always had the feeling that he drove a bit faster, having heard the fear in my voice on the phone. I didn't tell him about the man straight away. I still felt childish for even calling him to get me. A sheltered little brat that couldn't deal with a stranger. I honestly hoped that I could just go to bed and forget about the entire incident. That maybe someday I would look back on it and laugh. That didn't happen. 2 days later, the police showed up on my doorstep. They brought me in for questioning and asked me to tell them everything about my night at the movies. I wondered why they cared or how they even knew I had been at the movies, but told them everything I knew regardless. I told them about the man, about his rotting smell, about his deformities, about his whispering voice, and about how it made me physically ill just to be around him. They didn't believe me at first, but a similar-looking man showed up on the movie theater's security camera, the few that actually worked. Eventually, they told me that they were investigating several disappearances that occurred that night. Specifically, all 12 of the assorted staff and patrons that had been at the movies that night and had gone missing, with the exception of the clerk that had been working at the counter. He was found mauled, as if some animal had torn him apart. He was still in critical condition at the hospital and in no state to answer questions. It was the first time anything like this had ever happened in our small town. The public ate up the mystery, and the demand for information made me into somewhat of a local celebrity, much to my disdain. People were constantly asking me for interviews, and every time I told the story, I started to wish more and more that I could just forget it. I kept hoping that something else would happen that would grab people's attention, that the story would just quietly fade away so that I could go back to my normal life. 2 years later, I moved out of the state for college. I was always intending for it to be a temporary situation. I thought I'd move back home once things quieted down a little bit. But they didn't. Quite the opposite, actually. The story of that night grew into a sort of urban legend among the youth of the town. I still go home sometimes for holidays and such to visit my family. I visited the clerk in the hospital once. He was better, but he seemed to have contracted some strange disease. He had developed a strange rash on the tips of his fingers and around his mouth. He didn't talk much either because, according to the doctors, he developed painful sores in his throat and mouth that oozed a strange yellow pus. The doctors were baffled. I didn't visit him after that. For the most part, I'm happy where I am. nice and far away from the coastline. I've managed to build a good life here, away from the rumors and the talk. I've got a decent car, a good job, and some average friends. A nice, normal life. The only odd thing is, whenever my friends ask me out to the movies, I always decline. I've never told them why, and I don't intend to anytime soon. Whenever they ask me, I just look off into the distance and tell them, I'll catch it on DVD.